James Gray.
Mr. Lee, thank you very much for calling me. And can I start by apologising to the Honourable Lady for having missed the first few moments of her very interesting remarks, which I was held up elsewhere, and I apologise for that and to the House. I also apologise that I had not intended to speak in the debate today, and I apologise to the Speaker for not having written to him on the subject. But having heard the very interesting contributions by the Honourable Lady for Edgbaston and by the Honourable Gentleman, I hope the House will forgive me for a few ill-formed thoughts which may not take up very much the time. We have plenty of time available. It does seem to me that there are... First of all, can I congratulate the Honourable Lady for raising this issue? I think she's absolutely right in saying that the ethics and morals surrounding the use of unmanned air vehicles is as great or greater as discussion over morals and ethics associated with any armaments or warfare that exists. It's a huge ethical problem, and one which does need to be addressed. And I think she's absolutely right in saying we've addressed it too little in this place so far. So I very much congratulate her on raising the issue. I also listened very carefully to the extremely subtle and intelligent way that she approached the issue, and I have to say that I agree very much with every aspect of what she had to say. Nonetheless, Mr. Lee, I think there are a series of misunderstandings around in the world about the use of UAVs, and the word drones itself often brings into people's minds an image which is almost by definition worse than almost any other kind of warfare. If you asked, I think, the people out there in the street, what do you think of the use of drones, unmanned vehicles firing weapons at civilians in Pakistan, for example, people would say, well, that's absolutely disgraceful, it's scandalous, we must stop it, it's wicked, it's quite wrong. So there is a significant degree of misunderstanding, I think, about the use of these vehicles in the public domain, and therefore it's right that we here should try and, as best we can, try and correct that. Now, it seems to me there are two aspects to the ethical considerations. The first is there are those who would say the use of any kind of weapon of this kind at all is illegal, wicked, and should not be allowed. That was said by perfectly good pacifists in this building for many hundreds of years, and they would say that any weapon that potentially kills people is a bad thing. It should not be allowed. We should disarm, turn our weapons into plowshares, or words to that general effect. And that's a perfectly legitimate, if in my view, incorrect stance. The motto of my own regiment, the Honourable Artillery Company, is Arma Pacis Fulcra, which is, of course, the Latin for arms of the balance of peace. And I've always held very strongly by that. I think we won the Cold War not because we disarmed, but because Margaret Thatcher took a tough line by arming the United Kingdom and supporting the United States in our nuclear deterrence. That's why the Soviet Union fell. Arms were very much the balance of peace in that particular context. And therefore, to those who would say that under any conditions UAVs are by definition a bad thing, I would simply say, well, the same could apply to almost any weapon, any kind of piece of warfare you can mention. Of course, the tragedy is people are killed in wars. Even greater tragedy is civilians are killed in wars. That is an unacceptable and unforgivable thing to happen, but unfortunately, it does happen. And therefore, one of the important things that we have to do in considering warfare is working out ways in which civilians' collateral damage, as it's rather heartily called, can be minimized. We must find ways of minimizing the damage to civilians and those who are not actually involved in the conflict itself. But having accepted that all weapons are a bad thing, the second issue, I think, which people, very strange piece of psychology really, people seem to have in their minds, and the Honourable Lady touched on this in her interesting tale about Winston Churchill at the cavalry charge at Mafeking, I think it was, somehow or other shooting a man at a foot or 2 feet away, somehow is that more or less ethical than firing a weapon in Nevada which will kill people in Afghanistan? And most people would say Churchill was courageous in doing that. He galloped into the teeth of the enemy and he fired and he fought a person, he looked him in the eye and he shot him, and that's courageous. But a technician fiddling with a computer in Nevada who may kill hundreds of people potentially, that's somehow or other cowardly, hiding behind technology and saying, we want no part of that. I'm doing it remotely. Well, it's quite interesting to hear the Honourable Gentleman's intervention on the subject of the psychological effect that may occur to people who are firing these weapons at remote distances. Of course they're aware of what they're doing, and of course they will be affected by it for the rest of their lives. The notion that somehow, because they're in a bunker in Nevada, they are somehow or another less affected by the chap on the front line, I think is incorrect. I think it's quite an interesting point the Honourable Gentleman had to raise on that particular subject. So there's two, of course.
mention that because I think that's where the institutional ethics of the training of our military comes in, to ensure that that awareness, that at the end of every piece of machinery, on the other end, there is a human being, and that therefore the relationship and ethical considerations have to remain the same, and that is a constant battle of vigilance to ensure that that is never lost.
I think Don Blair is absolutely right. It's terribly important that we should train all of our people in the military and in foreign affairs and elsewhere that they are human beings at the end of the weapon, whether that weapon be a knife used in the front line or a UAV fired at in a very remote way. I was chilled at a recent visit to Afghanistan to meet a 19-year-old sniper in the rifles, and I said to him, "How many kills have you had?" He's 19 years old. He said, 37 confirmed kills, sir, and about 40 or 50 others unconfirmed. Here's a young man aged 19 who knows he's killed 37 people, probably killed 70 or 80. Is the psychological effect on him any greater or any less than the psychological effect on the man sitting in the bunker in Nevada, where it may be, who is called upon to press that switch that finally fires the weapon from the UAV? So there's two elements of concern, one about the use of weapons themselves. I think it's a perfectly reasonable concern, but one to which I would not subscribe. And the second being this question about whether or not a remote killing is somehow or other less brave or less ethically supportable than an immediate killing. And again, I would not support that particular angle. Which brings me on, I think, away from the negatives that might be used on the subject of UAVs to the positives. And I mentioned a moment ago that it seems to me to be terribly important that we, in all of our warfare, whatever we're doing, whether it be planes, bombs, or UAVs, we should seek to minimize civilian casualties. Mr. Lee, the use of UAVs in this extremely complex and high technology is precisely the thing which will actually reduce collateral damage. You can, by using these things, spot a particular person from a very great height. You can spot a particular person, you can track his movements, you know precisely who he is, and you can actually kill him very precisely, very technically, and minimizing damage to civilians who may be nearby. That stands in sharp contrast to the use of artillery, for example, which takes out a grid square, 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters. One round takes out a grid square. Who knows what's in that grid square? It stands in stark contrast to bombs of all kinds, of course, which equally have very substantial collateral damage. The use of these weapons is very particular and very precise, and for that reason has to be supported, of course.
There is a problem on mythologizing this issue of that they are precision weapons that are, again, can target individuals and not have an impact upon innocent civilians. We now know with more detailed research that in Pakistan, for example, there's at least 3,225 civilians that have been killed as a result of the use of drones. So it's important as well not to exaggerate the clinical effect of these weapons.
That's great.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely correct, and every single civilian death that's occurred as a result of the use of drones or through any other act of warfare is to be regretted. But he mentioned 3,000 civilians who've been killed due to drones in Pakistan. I suggest to him that in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so many other theatres of war across the world, there have been many times that number of civilians killed, collateral damage through bombs and conventional warfare of one kind or another. Those particular deaths are very questionable. I'll come on in a moment to talk about the way in which UAVs are being used, in particular in Pakistan, across borders from where the theatre of war actually is. Every single death is regrettable. But what I would say is that as this technology develops, it is becoming more and more and more accurate, more and more and more reliable, and therefore the risk of that happening becomes less and less and less. Whereas conventional weapons of warfare are becoming no more accurate than they ever were. Indeed, you could argue that because they're becoming bigger area weapons, they're becoming less accurate and the likelihood of collateral damage is greater, is a possible argument. The honourable gentleman does bring me on, though, to this question about where and how these weapons should be used. First of all, of course, most of them are used for surveillance, not used as weapons at all. They're not armed, they are used for surveillance, and they provide a fantastic resource for our forces in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The ability to see what's happening on the ground over a very large area over an extended period, these things can, as it were, hover for significant periods of time over an area which a plane or a helicopter couldn't do. The value as surveillance machines is incredible. And even if they aren't armed, the development of the technology is something which we must be extremely proud of and encourage in every possible way. However, the likelihood is that if we were to look at the battlefield 50 years from now, the likelihood is, and the Honourable Gentleman is quite right in saying, the likelihood is the significant part of that battlefield will be dominated by unmanned aerial vehicles. They will be used extensively in battlefields in the future. Now, I welcome that very strongly for several allied reasons. The first is this question of accuracy, which may not entirely exist at the moment, but I hope will become increasingly accurate in the future. And as I think the Honourable Lady mentioned, warfare is no longer state-on-state warfare, nice and easy to do, invade that country and you can sort them out, nice and easy to do in the Falklands, nice and easy to do in Gulf One. Warfare no longer exists like that. Warfare now is, by definition, there are civilians, there are all kinds of people mixed up around wicked people, very often who use civilians as shields. Accuracy is terribly important. And secondly, I think, maximising the effect while minimising the cost is terribly important. Of course, you can pile in tens of thousands of foot soldiers who will slog around large parts of the theatre of war without ever seeing the enemy at all very, very often. But it does cost an enormous amount of money. And of course, you can use conventional weapons at once or another. They cost an enormous amount of money. These cost, by comparison, remarkably little money because you can fly them for a very long time, never fire anything. When you do fire them, the weapons need not be as expensive as conventional weapons very often are. Thirdly, I think that there is no question about it, they're much safer to use for our own forces than most conventional warfare. If you send soldiers into the theatre of war to fire a tank or to fire an artillery piece or to take part in an infantry attack, or as Churchill did to gallop against the whirling dervishes at the Battle of Mafeking, it was a dervish, I think, wasn't it? You are by definition putting your own troops in significant amounts of danger. These weapons, the worst thing that could possibly happen to them is that they'll be shot out of the sky. Not one single person will be killed if they are disabled, whereas, of course, that doesn't apply to any other type of warfare. So there is a huge benefit to be gained from the standpoint of the security and safety of our own troops. Final point I just make very briefly, Mr. Lee, if I may, is that I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely correct. These weapons in the wrong hands or used incorrectly could become terrible weapons of warfare. We should not allow that ever to occur. It is vitally important that we should know precisely who is allowed to use them, under precisely what conditions they may be used, what are the rules of engagement, what are the chains of command, who is the authority to use them, who does not. Is it purely military, or could other government agencies use them at some stage in the future? If so, who authorised that use? What use are they authorised for? Are they to be used entirely against military targets? Are there conditions under which they could be used against civilian targets? Would it be right, for example, if we knew of some terrible dictator driving along in his car, is it right that we should use a military UAV to kill him? Possibly it is, possibly it isn't. We do need to know very precisely whether or not it is. So I do think the debate which the Honourable Lady has opened is an extremely important one. This is an enormously powerful, enormously important potential series of weapons and vehicles. They could be of huge benefit to Britain as a war-going nation. They could also be of huge disbenefit if they fall in the wrong hands or if they're used incorrectly. I therefore think that the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, that now is the time to initiate a widespread and deep and ongoing debate about precisely what these things are, what they should be used for, what the rules of engagement are, and who should be allowed to use them. If we do that, then the time spent this afternoon in this chamber will have been well spent.